It was just another night shift at McDonald's in that small, barely noticeable town. I'd been working at the same restaurant for 2 years, long enough to know the drill. The smell of fries and burgers in the air, the clink of the drive-thru window opening, the hum of the fryer, it was all routine. But that night, something felt off from the very start. I was working the late shift, the one that stretched past midnight, when the usual crowd starts to thin out. The late-night regulars had come and gone, and by 2 a.m., there were only a few cars left in the parking lot. I had just finished cleaning the counter when a man in his late 40s, wearing a weathered denim jacket, walked in. I remember thinking he looked odd, like someone who had been traveling for a long time. His clothes were dusty, his hair unkempt, and his eyes, well, his eyes were different. It wasn't just the tired look you see in most late-night customers. There was something about him, something off. He didn't order anything at first. He just stood there, staring at the menu board as though he was trying to remember something. I tried to ignore him, but I couldn't help but feel his presence, like he was waiting for something. Finally, he approached the counter and ordered a simple Big Mac, a drink, and fries. As I prepared his order, I noticed something strange. There was a faint smell in the air, not the typical scent of the kitchen, but something, metallic, almost like blood. I looked around, confused, but I didn't see anything that could explain it. When I handed him his food, he didn't thank me. He didn't say a word. He just nodded, took the tray, and walked toward a booth near the corner of the restaurant. That should have been the end of it. But as the minutes passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It felt like the air in the restaurant was getting heavier, colder. I glanced over at the man in the booth. He was eating slowly, methodically, as if he wasn't really hungry, just going through the motions. I tried to focus on my work, but it was hard. The quiet was unsettling. No one else was in the restaurant, and the usual sounds of the fryer and the grill seemed distant, muffled. Then, out of nowhere, the man looked up at me. His eyes locked onto mine. I froze. He smiled, just a little, but it wasn't a normal smile. It was twisted, like he knew something I didn't. Something I didn't want to know. Before I could look away, he stood up, dropped his tray on the table, and walked toward the door. He didn't say anything. Didn't even make a sound. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a strange guy, right? But as I looked down at the counter where he had been sitting, I saw something that made my heart drop. A small, blood-red stain on the edge of the booth. I tried to convince myself it was just ketchup. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The clock on the wall ticked louder now, almost as if time itself was trying to warn me. I should have locked the doors and closed up, but I was too tired. Too exhausted from the routine of the day. I went to clean up the booth where the man had been sitting. The stain still lingered on the seat, dark and unnatural against the bright red of the vinyl. I ran my fingers over it, hoping it would come off easily, but it didn't. It was sticky, thick, almost like it was drying too fast. I grabbed a rag from under the counter and wiped at it, but it didn't fade. It almost seemed to spread, like it was bleeding into the fabric. I stopped, and for a moment, I just stood there, staring at the stain. That feeling in the pit of my stomach was back again. It was the same feeling you get when something's wrong but you don't know what yet. That's when I heard it. A noise. At first, I thought it was the sound of the kitchen exhaust fan or a crack in the walls, but as I listened, it became clear, it was a soft tapping sound, like someone was knocking on the glass of the drive-thru window. I froze, trying to pinpoint where the noise was coming from. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate, to be the wind or the usual sounds of a late-night shift. I looked over to the drive-thru window. The blinds were drawn, but a sliver of light from the street lamp outside illuminated the room just enough to make it feel claustrophobic. The tapping continued. I walked over cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. My legs felt heavy, like they didn't want to move, but somehow I found the strength to pull the blinds up. There was no one. The parking lot was empty, not a single car in sight. But the tapping hadn't stopped. It was coming from the back of the restaurant. The storage area. I hesitated. I could just ignore it, finish cleaning, go home, pretend it was just my imagination. But I couldn't. Something inside me told me to check. I walked through the kitchen, every step echoing in the silence. When I reached the back door, I stopped. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see movement inside. A shadow, moving quickly. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The shadow stopped. I knew someone, or something, was there. I was too scared to open the door. And then I heard it again, the soft, deliberate tapping, now unmistakably coming from the back room. The tapping became louder, faster, like a countdown. I felt my breath get shallow. Whatever was in there wasn't just tapping anymore. It was knocking. Harder. I stood there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity, staring at the door. Finally, I forced myself to turn and run to the front of the restaurant. My fingers fumbled with the keys, desperately trying to lock the door. But it was too late. The bell above the door jingled as the man from earlier walked back in. His eyes met mine, and the twisted smile returned. This time, I couldn't look away. The door closed behind him with a soft click, too soft for the weight of what was happening. My heart was pounding in my ears, but my legs felt like lead. I tried to speak, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. The man didn't make a sound, he just stood there, his back to the door, his eyes fixed on me with that same unnerving smile. I tried to swallow the knot in my throat, to think of something, anything, to do. But it was like I was frozen in place, unable to move or even breathe. My fingers shook as I clutched the counter, trying to steady myself. He started walking toward me, slow and deliberate, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of the dining area. The closer he got, the heavier the air seemed to become. It was suffocating, like the entire restaurant was closing in on me. "Can I help you?" I managed to croak, the words barely escaping my lips. I immediately regretted them, wishing I had just kept quiet. He didn't answer. Instead, he just stopped a few feet away, still staring at me, still smiling, but his eyes, they weren't human anymore. There was something in them, something dark and predatory. It was as if he was studying me, waiting for the moment when I'd break, when I'd realize that I was no longer in control. And then, for the first time, he spoke. "Do you know what it's like?" he asked, his voice low and hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in years. "To be lost?" I didn't know how to answer. I wanted to back away, but my feet felt glued to the floor. He tilted his head, almost curiously, watching me with those unnatural eyes. "Lost, like this place. It's always open, isn't it?" His smile deepened, as though he was sharing some sick, twisted secret. "Always feeding people. But it never stops. No one ever leaves." I couldn't understand what he was saying, but the dread that was crawling up my spine told me it wasn't something I wanted to know. Suddenly, the sound of the back door opening broke the silence, a loud creak cutting through the tension. It was like the world shifted, and all I could hear was that haunting noise, the same rhythmic tapping from earlier. It was louder now, closer. I turned to look, and my blood ran cold. The shadow I had seen in the back room earlier had moved out of the storage area and into the hallway. It was now standing at the far end of the kitchen, just barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, too tall, its form unnatural, twisted in ways that didn't make sense. And then it spoke. "Don't let him take you." The voice was guttural, distorted, like it was being dragged across the floor. My body went rigid, and the man in front of me only laughed, a sound that was cold and empty. "I told you," he said, his voice low and satisfied. "No one leaves. Not here. Not ever." And then he turned, heading toward the back door, his footsteps silent once again. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I bolted. I ran out the front door and into the parking lot, my feet barely touching the ground. I didn't stop until I reached my car, my heart hammering in my chest. I could still hear the tapping, soft, steady, echoing in my head, as though it was following me. And even now, as I sit here, writing this, I can't escape the feeling that I'm being watched. That whatever was in that McDonald's, whatever was waiting, is still out there, still looking for the next person to take. The worst part? I'm afraid that if I ever go back, the man in the denim jacket will be waiting for me. And next time, he might not be so quiet. I didn't go back to that McDonald's. Not for weeks. I told myself it was just a bad experience, maybe a trick of the mind or stress from the long shifts. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something wrong, something I couldn't explain, something I didn't want to face. So, I avoided it. But avoiding the truth didn't make it go away. The nightmares started a few nights after I left. At first, they were subtle. Little things, sounds of the drive-thru bell ringing, the smell of fries burning, the cold, metallic taste in the air. But then, they escalated. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart racing, the sound of tapping still echoing in my ears. And then the dreams became more vivid. I was back inside the McDonald's, but it wasn't the same place. The walls were darker, the lights flickered, and the chairs in the dining area were scattered in odd, unnatural positions. It felt like I was walking through a nightmare that stretched on forever. The man in the denim jacket would always be there, sitting at a booth, staring at me with those eyes, that smile, just waiting. He never moved, never spoke. But I could feel him watching, waiting for me to approach. Every time I tried to leave, something would stop me. The doors wouldn't open. The windows were sealed shut. It was as if the restaurant itself was holding me prisoner. And then, one night, the man moved. I had gotten up to clean the counter, just like I used to do at the end of my shifts, but when I looked up, he was standing right in front of me, too close. I could smell him now, dirt, decay, and something else, something rotten. He leaned in, his breath cold against my skin, and whispered, "You shouldn't have left." I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My throat was dry, my body frozen in place. And then, the tapping started again. Only this time, it wasn't just from the back room. It was coming from everywhere, from the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. It was like 1,000 fingers tapping at once. It grew louder, faster, more frantic. My head was spinning, and I stumbled back, desperate to get away, but the man reached out and grabbed my arm. His grip was like ice. His fingers dug into my skin, leaving bruises where he touched me. "You can't run," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "You'll never leave this place." And then, in that nightmare, I saw it, the shadow, the tall, twisted figure I had glimpsed in the back room. It was standing behind the man, towering over him, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It was staring at me. I tried to pull away, but the man's grip tightened, and the shadow moved closer. I could hear its breath now, ragged and wet, like something that didn't belong. The room started to close in on me, the walls pressing in from all sides. The tapping was deafening, and the smell of blood, of rot, filled my nose. That's when I woke up. I shot up in bed, gasping for air, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break through my chest. But when I looked around, the nightmare didn't fade. It followed me. The tapping. It was coming from the window. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The tapping was slow at first, then grew faster, like the rhythm of a countdown. I turned my head, terrified to look outside, but I had to. Through the blinds, I saw the outline of a figure, tall, dark, moving slowly toward my window. I couldn't move. My body felt paralyzed, as if whatever was out there was controlling me. The tapping stopped. And then, just like that, the figure was gone. But it didn't matter. I knew it was still there. And I knew it was never going to stop. I never slept well after that night. Each time I closed my eyes, the tapping would start again, growing louder, faster. It haunted me in my dreams and my waking hours, a constant, oppressive presence that wouldn't let me go. It was as if I was tethered to that McDonald's, bound by some invisible force, and no matter where I went, it would follow. I thought about quitting my job, packing up and moving away. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized there was nowhere to hide. The man in the denim jacket wasn't just at the restaurant. He was everywhere. The feeling of being watched, that sense of dread, followed me no matter where I went. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back. I had to face whatever was waiting for me in that McDonald's. So, one night, a few weeks after everything started, I found myself walking through the front doors of the restaurant. It was closed, but the parking lot was empty, and the lights inside flickered faintly through the windows. The building looked just like it always had, too familiar, too normal. But as soon as I stepped inside, I knew something had changed. The air was thicker, heavier, like I was stepping into something I wasn't supposed to understand. It was too quiet. No fryer sizzles, no hum of the air conditioning, nothing but the oppressive silence that weighed down on me. The lights flickered again, and the temperature dropped. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, suddenly aware of how cold it had become. My breath fogged in front of me. And then, I heard it. The tapping. It was coming from the back, from the kitchen area, just like before. The same rhythmic noise that had followed me for so long. It felt like it was calling to me, pulling me deeper into the restaurant. I walked forward, step by step, unable to turn back now. As I reached the back hallway, the lights flickered out, leaving me in darkness. My heart raced as I reached for my phone, using its flashlight to guide me down the narrow corridor. The tapping had stopped, but I could still hear the faint whisper of something moving, something just out of sight. I rounded the corner, and there it was, the back room, the place where it had all started. The door was slightly ajar, the same way it had been the night I first saw the shadow. I hesitated, then pushed the door open. Inside, everything was as it should have been, except for the figure standing in the middle of the room. The man in the denim jacket was there, just like before. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, in the shadows, the tall, twisted figure stood, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It was impossibly tall, its form shifting, its limbs bending in ways that weren't natural. I wanted to run. I should have run. But my legs wouldn't move. The man in the denim jacket turned slowly, that same twisted smile spreading across his face. "You came back," he said, his voice low and mocking. "You shouldn't have. You're part of the order now. You'll never leave, just like the rest of us." I wanted to scream, to beg for help, but the words wouldn't come. The shadow moved, creeping toward me with slow, deliberate steps. I could hear its breath now, ragged and wet, like it was inhaling through a gaping wound. The tapping started again. It wasn't coming from the walls this time, it was coming from inside me, like my own heartbeat had turned into the rhythm of that incessant sound. I took a step back, but the man caught my arm before I could retreat. "You can't escape," he whispered in my ear. "This place never lets go. You belong to it now." The last thing I remember is the shadow's hand reaching for me, its fingers cold and jagged, before everything went black. When I woke up, I was no longer in the restaurant. At least, not the way it had been before. Everything was different now. I was lying on the floor of what looked like a maintenance closet, the walls covered in peeling paint and rusted pipes. The dim light from a flickering bulb above me barely illuminated the room. I could feel a dull ache in my head, a heavy weight in my chest, and when I tried to move, my body screamed in protest. But there was no time to think about that. Something was wrong. The tapping had returned, but this time, it wasn't just faint, it was everywhere. It was coming from the walls, from the floors, from the very air itself. It was like 1,000 tiny fingers, tapping, scratching, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I forced myself to sit up, the pain in my head blurring my vision for a moment. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone. The screen lit up, and I saw a dozen missed calls and messages. They were all from people I didn't know, numbers I didn't recognize. Each message was the same: get out. But there was no time to make sense of it. I stood up unsteadily, my legs shaky beneath me, and stumbled toward the door. I grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, sealed tight. Panic set in. I pounded on the door, shouting, begging for help. But the silence that followed was worse than anything. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was coming from inside my own skull. I stepped back from the door, taking in my surroundings. The maintenance closet was small, almost claustrophobic, with a few cleaning supplies scattered in the corner. But there was a small window, too high to reach, with a dirty, cracked glass that offered a glimpse of the outside world. It was dark, the sky overcast, as if time itself had stopped. I knew I needed to get out, but I couldn't figure out how. I couldn't see a way. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, moving slowly across the floor toward me. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, but no one was there. The tapping was louder now, almost deafening. I tried the door again, pulling with all my strength, but it didn't budge. It was as though the building itself was keeping me inside, trapping me in a nightmare I couldn't escape. And then, the lights went out. The tapping stopped. I was in complete darkness. Complete silence. For what felt like an eternity, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then, just as suddenly as the silence had come, it was broken. A voice. It was faint at first, a whisper, but it grew louder, clearer. "You're never leaving." It wasn't the man in the denim jacket's voice this time. It was something else, something deeper, colder. The figure appeared in front of me, its tall, twisted form silhouetted against the faint light of the hallway. The shadow loomed over me, the smell of decay and rot flooding my senses. It spoke again, its voice a rasping whisper. "Do you want to know why no one ever leaves? Because they are part of it now. You're just another piece of the puzzle. Another soul to feed it." I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was paralyzed, caught in the suffocating grip of whatever this thing was. And then, I saw the man in the denim jacket again. He was standing just behind the shadow, his smile stretching impossibly wide. "You're here now," he said, his voice echoing in my ears. "Just like the rest of them. Forever." I didn't know what that meant, but I didn't need to. I already knew. I was trapped. Trapped in the McDonald's, with no way out. I had become part of whatever dark force controlled that place. And now, I would never leave. The cold was unbearable. My limbs felt like lead, and I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The man in the denim jacket stepped closer, his presence looming over me like a shadow that would never lift. He reached out, his fingers cold as ice, brushing against my cheek, his smile widening into something monstrous. "You thought you could escape, didn't you?" he whispered, his voice echoing in the emptiness. "But once you step inside this place, you belong to it. You belong to us. And there's no leaving." The shadow behind him shifted again, its body twisting, growing larger, more grotesque. Its glowing eyes pierced the darkness, staring straight through me. It didn't need to speak, it didn't have to. The sense of dread was enough. I could feel it, gnawing at my very soul, crawling into my mind. The tapping started again, but it wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, crawling beneath my skin, making my heart race in panic. It was as if the walls, the floor, the air itself were alive, feeding off my fear, getting stronger. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen. The man's voice broke through the terror, soft but deliberate. Do you see now? It's too late. You're already one of us. In that moment, I knew he was right. I had never truly escaped. The nightmare had followed me, and now I was part of it. The McDonald's wasn't just a building. It wasn't just a place where people came for a quick meal. It was something older, darker, a place that fed on the souls of those who entered, trapping them in a never-ending cycle. I looked around frantically, searching for a way out, but there was no exit. No window to break through, no door to open. Just endless shadows and the feeling of being suffocated. The tapping became more frantic, louder, as if hundreds of people were knocking, clawing at the walls, trapped just like me. The shadow grew closer, its shape becoming more defined, its fingers long and twisted, reaching for me. I didn't have the strength to fight back. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. The shadow's hand gripped my arm, and I felt a coldness like nothing I had ever experienced before. It was like my very life was being drained from me, piece by piece. The man in the denim jacket leaned in close, his breath cold against my ear. "Welcome to your new home," he whispered. "Forever." And then, just like that, everything went black. The story ends here. But if you ever find yourself in a McDonald's late at night, alone, and you hear that tapping, you might just want to leave. Because some things in that place are waiting for someone to come back. And once they have you, they never let go.